Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the 11th episode of the Geoconservative Files on Degeneracy versus Traditionalism. My name is Mr. Geocon, and with me today is an old friend of mine, an old acquaintance, Fritz Imperial.
Hello.
Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience in case nobody's heard of you?
Well, I used to run a YouTube channel here back since 2016. I was around that time that people like me and the Distributist and eventually people like Geocon essentially diverged from the path of the anti-SJWs crowd like Sargon and Kraut T, or more accurately stepped out of the shadows and realized, well, we're Christians, they're not. We ultimately have different worldviews in the sense that we are not actually, I am not a liberal, unlike Sargon, say. And well, for a while I've been, I've taken some hiatuses. I'm trying to get away from that. I have some new ideas, but I would like to, the future of my channel is I'm thinking of transitioning to doing maybe some critiques on some games to try and get some more views. But I also have a bunch of history videos I want to talk about. The first being I want to do a nice video on the Republic of Pirates from the early 18th century. I'm also looking into doing a video on exploring the genre of solar punk, which, if you've heard of the cyberpunk genre, i.e., things like Ghost in the Shell, Blade Runner, and whatnot, and the new big game that's coming out. Solar punk is apparently what's supposed to be its antithesis, i.e., a vision of a future in which the social and ecological, specifically, problems are actually resolved, and how we might have a future if, say, ecological sustainability is a priority and still giving humanity a, fulfilling life.
That's actually pretty neat. So would you say? I mean, I've seen some eco-punk stuff, and it seems like very. It seems like a lot of fiction. It's dominated by sort of this kind of progressivism.
Oh yes, it is very progressive, but it's still, I think, worth looking into, just in the sense of what somebody is trying to create as the antithesis of cyberpunk, which is kind of the dominant, it's one of the big dominant, I would say combine that with things like, say, Game of Thrones, and there seems just to be a lot of nihilism or negativity in terms of genre fiction lately. And if there's somebody who's trying to say, hey, maybe there's a positive outlook there, I think that's looking into. I certainly understand that it is dominated by progressives, because it's in it itself is a progressive idea of improving upon the future, I guess striving towards some form of goal. But there might be something. It's interesting. The Distributist, reminds me of when he was talking about how early on, like back in the 2000s, when people were talking about steampunk, he thought, oh, this could be a opportunity for, traditionalism, because it's all based on like the 19th century. But no, not really. It's based on just, oh, this looks cool. Whereas at least solar punk might actually have some ideas.
Find the best ideas in odd places.
Because there's nothing really inherently anti-right wing or anti-traditionalist about environmentalism, is there?
Well, I mean, it really depends on like what you consider to be environmentalism, because these environmentalists, they are what one I think Ben Shapiro was one person who put it best when he said they're green, they're like watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside.
Well, and that's the opportunity we have, because I remember one video I saw, Stefan Molyneux made a point in which the modern environmentalist movement really doesn't seem to care about the environment. Else, the actual policies they would advocate for would be things like immediately stopping immigration, because that moves people from low carbon emission countries into becoming high carbon producers, and getting rid of divorce, because every family that gets divorced means you have to double housing costs, and that means more consumption. You have to buy twice as many things.
Well, it's sort of like, well, there's also the I think another factor that a lot of modern environmentalists do not get into is the factor of human nature, because we're all concerned about preserving nature as a whole. That we aren't really concerned about the specific human nature. What are our natural tendencies, our natural needs?
Because I think that's the point of the problem, of course, is with the people that essentially make worshiping the environment their new god, is essentially that's eventually when you get to the anti-natalists and just pure anti-human people, where they think, well, if the entire goal is to reduce the human impact on the environment as much as possible, well, then if you just get rid of humans, that will fix the problem. Now, obviously, I actually have an investment in not being destroyed, and think that there must be some form of compromise or way of being able to have a sustainable relationship with the planet, but whilst still being able to live full human lives. And I think that's where so much of the opposition of people saying, yes, eating bugs instead of beef is more environmentally friendly, but it's dehumanizing and humiliating.
Well, more than that, it's like there are places in the world where they do eat bugs, but that's a part of their culture. Like, it's not really
or it's what they do for survival, whereas we don't have to stoop to that for survival. It's for a more abstract purpose, I suppose, and that's a much harder sell.
It is, and it also gets to, and this concept of like fulfilling human nature gets us to something I've been sort of researching, and that is this idea of what I've come to term surplus desire. Now, we as Catholics believe, if you're a Thomist, you believe that there are these basic there are these 5 basic inclinations that are natural to us: to seek the good, including the highest good, which is eternal happiness with God; to preserve yourself in existence; to preserve the species through sexual procreation; to live in community with others; and to use the intellect and will to know truth. And those are some of our natural desires. However, there are surplus desires that are sort of imposed on us by authority figures through indoctrination. Like, for instance, we could say that the desire to eat is a natural desire, but the desire to eat specifically a hamburger is not something that is natural. It's been imposed by us by advertising, for example. Or the idea, or to go to more abstract, the desire for like freedom and democracy is imposed by us by our education as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sort of ties into what I wanted to talk about, which is the idea of degeneracy, which is, I have my own theories about it, but essentially it's where you have these kinds of imposed desires on us that contradict our basic natural tendencies, that what's good for us by our nature. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Though for me, I thought about degeneracy in a different way, if I could share that.
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear what your opinions on it.
My idea of because this has been thrown around, of course, a lot by people, and I guess originally the alt-right and now our sphere, is the idea of degeneracy and the idea of degeneration of society towards a more, I don't know, because there's the idea of what our true, I guess, primal in the sense, spiritual sense of what we were created to be is to be one with God. But then there's also, I guess, what Freud would have called the id. So I always tend to think that there's always this kind of violent and kind of animalistic nature that's within all humans, and that we do what we can to not so much suppress it, but control it. Everybody has violent urges and thoughts, but most people, unless you're a sociopath or just completely crazy, you are able to control that. But in any case, my point is that in the modern world, with the dismantling of Christendom and society running out of the fumes it was running on from Christendom, to me, it seems like compared to what society and Western civilization looked like back in, say, 1900, things actually seem to have regressed quite considerably, not just in the sense of like things are morally that we would normally in a sane society would consider morally reprehensible, but it just seems like the human spirit and humanity itself is almost devolving back to a much more simplistic nature. And it's kind of one of the scariest things about it is I can kind of see that there's a degradation of language, especially the English language, in which being able to articulate complicated concepts and words is something that we kind of take for granted. But the thing is, if people aren't taught how to speak correctly and write correctly and communicate, that makes, being ruled by tyranny and being able to grasp more complicated and abstract thoughts much harder if you can't come up with the words to describe them.
Of course. And I think that, and I think that's sort of what I wanted to talk about later, which is that, a lot of this is brought about by powerful people for cynical purposes. But I'd like to hear what your thoughts on, my idea of what degeneracy is. When, most people talk about degeneracy, there are a lot of different there's a lot of different ideas that float around. But in Christian circles, at least, when we talk about the degenerate, we're usually talking about what Thomas Aquinas called effeminacy. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean men who have like womanly traits, although it could be that. No, effeminacy is the tendency to shy away from doing what is good out of fear of being deprived of pleasure. It's where you'd rather pursue what is pleasurable rather than what is good. And I talked about this in one of in my first response video on this channel. There was a YouTuber named Thoughtslime. He's a left-wing anarchist breadtuber, and I pointed out a number of defects in his argument for political correctness. The most egregious one being how some of his arguments basically amounted to, it's a private company, bro, even though he's a communist. So that was an odd take. But and what I think really happened with someone like Thoughtslime is that he was addicted to this sort of social niceties, the pleasantries, and that's really one of the main things behind political correctness. If you read Moldbug, it's basically powerful people hijacking people's basic decency to
what would have been considered Christian decency.
Yeah, and going along with this.
If you notice, it used to be being Christian used to also be an adjective to describe being a genuinely good person, whereas now in a post-Christian world, you have to be described as a good person, and people still have a somewhat warped sense of what that is, despite the entirety of modern society, of modernity being built upon moral relativism.
Well, it's kind of interesting, but it's a kind of an inconsistent moral relativism at that, because if you were like, and this is something that's been pointed out. If you were to ask, the average left-wing college student, like the moral differences between Stalin in America, Stalin's Russia and America, he wouldn't be. He would say, "Oh, it's morally relative and stuff." But if you were going to ask him about Hitler in America, he'd obviously say that America's superior compared to Hitler, and that's
Go ahead.
yeah, and that's sort of like, and I think I think it's not so much relativism as what Alistair McIntyre called emotivism, which is essentially where you base your the moral foundations are based on you sort of the kinds of feelings that you have, which if you as we discussed earlier, could be manipulated.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the thing is, the modern world, people de facto believe in some sort of morality, but the de jure, in a way, philosophy of the modern world is relativism. And it's kind of where you get things like that, the Hitchens two-step, right? Where Christopher Hitchens would often say, within the same sentence, or a lot of these new atheists would say, morality is relative, God is evil. And they don't find a contradiction in that.
Well, I mean, I have two different ideas on that. One is that the relativism could be entirely cynical. It's like a cynical stance that you adopt in order to avoid having to talk about moral questions. And the reason why they avoid talking about moral questions gets back to what you said earlier about language. Specifically, our language surrounding morality has been completely desiccated.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what there's a great Thomist author named Alistair McIntyre who wrote a book called After Virtue, which talked about how the Enlightenment basically destroyed our ability to talk about morality.
Mm-hmm.
And
because
go on.
It has the Enlightenment and the imposition of and growth of the liberal democratic world order, starting in, say, France, England, and America, and then expanding outwards to much of the world now. It's shifted morality to make it so that the good is no longer being, I guess, individual freedom is no longer right because it's good. It's good because it makes you, something is good because it makes you free, rather than freedom is a good thing.
Oh, yes. I would say that that sort of gets into my other idea, which is that democracy, what we have in liberalism, and you see this, what you have in liberalism is that you see this with F.A. Hayek on the right, and with John Rawls on the left. This idea that the good and evil are things you say about systems. That there is not really like anything you're objectively supposed to value, but rather a good system is defined as something that can fulfill the desires of the masses, while an evil system is one that suppresses their desires through tyranny.
The great irony is that I kind of see the Enlightenment as basically putting a cage around people and calling that freedom, or rather, they put a cage around humanity, i.e., preventing us from being able to experience a greater spiritual self, as in, medieval man. As in our, Christians and spiritual people understand. The point being is that humanity didn't really, Western Europeans didn't really think about there wasn't really a concept of political thought prior to the Enlightenment, right? There wasn't this idea of, oh, are you liberal? Are you conservative? Do you believe in this ideology or that ideology? That just didn't really exist prior, really, until the 17th century. And so essentially they put this cage of forcing the masses to think about politics all of the time. and clouded them from being able to understand that there's things more important than that. And what I'd say is that,
political ideology. I just wanted to say that political ideology is sort of a morality substitute, wouldn't you say?
yes, yeah. Things are good because they're more liberal. The more liberal you are, the more good you are.
Oh yes, I mean that is like the heart of one of like all left a lot of leftist thought. It's just you believe that because you are left wing, that is just being left wing is just being a good person, and vice versa. And there's a great book, and you'll love the title of this book. It's called "If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich?" But it's written by a guy named G.A. Cohen, who is a very radical socialist, like uber radical socialist. And he makes this point but he attacks the left for just being for this kind of amoralism that he sees on the left. And he says we need to return to Christian morality in order to be more consistent egalitarians, because we basically what he's found among his fellow leftists is that they can only talk about good and evil systems, and a good system is a system that fulfills the desires of the masses, while an evil system is tyrannical. And we can't really talk about individual virtue anymore.
No, I mean, I consider myself to be a Confucian in terms of philosophy, or rather, he's the philosopher that's influenced me the most. And his biggest point and his main point was that the highest good you can do, an individual man can do, is the accumulation of virtue. And yet, it's not virtue. What the left does when they talk about virtue signaling, that has nothing to do with virtue. It has to do with that description of they act like the Indian Brahmins rather than the British aristocrats, the sense of they are the holier than thou rulers of society. And it's how you get the idea of the left that's supposed to be they have their platonic idea of the good working class and the good minority. And yet, in reality, most college leftists and left-wing people seem to have absolutely nothing but utter and total disdain and hatred for the poor and working class in this country.
Well, because
they're white.
Well, it's because a lot of them have very different class interests than the working class. A lot of these but that's actually getting into a very different topic, which is like, what are the class interests of leftists versus actual working class people? But what I would talk about is, like, how does degeneracy play? How does this idea of degeneracy play into this dynamic of politics taking over for traditional morality, political ideology becoming the marker of virtue?
The 20th century, and the end of the 19th century, which you could kind of argue was the zenith of Western civilization, when you had people like Nietzsche, right? And since beginning of time, everybody's asked the idea and ponder the idea of what's the meaning of life? What is our purpose here? And people mostly found metaphysical answers to that. And Nietzsche essentially opened the genie's lamp or whatever, when he kind of entertained the idea that, well, what if there isn't any actual point? And essentially that drove him crazy. But later philosophers and thinkers essentially took that and ran with it and came up with modern ideas of relativism and whatnot. People like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, essentially the idea that there is no greater meaning to life. And once you have that, the victory of relativism and the idea of rejecting meaning or rejecting transcendent meaning comes from the fact that throughout the 20th century, you had the perfect combination of, number one, the Industrial Revolution ramping up to the point where people's every material desire can now be fulfilled on a massive scale. And especially with the internet, you can finally have mass sexual pleasure with pornography. The huge numbers of world wars and genocides and tyrannical regimes that spread up in the 20th century really kind of had a lot of people lose their faith in greater humanity or transcendent values. And it all played into the hands of both these radical philosophers and massive corporations. And it seems like, well, this neoliberalism stuff where, morality really doesn't matter anymore. Virtue doesn't matter because now you have all the porn, food, and anything else that could get your dopamine receptors going that you want, and you'll basically do and vote for whatever we say.
I would like to also point out that it wasn't like this kind of consumerism was inevitable in some way. I mean, sure, you could say that the world wars did ruin a lot of people, and this promotion of Nietzschean relativism did a lot to the people. But I would point out that what we would call the consumer is actually a very modern invention. It's also an invention of powerful people. Specifically, I'd point to a guy named Edward Bernays,
Mm-hmm.
who was Sigmund Freud's nephew. And kind of ironic that you were talking about the id and the superego earlier. Edward Bernays was a guy who he assisted President Woodrow Wilson's World War I propaganda efforts. He was like the PR guy for Calvin Coolidge, one of our like free market people. He was heavily promoted in Hollywood and marketing and business. He spread his uncle's ideas all over the place. And part of Sigmund Freud's theory was that it was very elitist, first of all, and it was essentially that the dark desires of the masses needed to be controlled in order to have civilization. And so the people who ran these these captains of industry types, who were up until this point, they were stereotyped as being pretty conservative. They started promoting what we would call consumerism, or degeneracy in like an economic sense. Where people are more concerned with keeping up with the Joneses than being a virtuous Christian, and they did this through advertisements, which Bernays basically described as a form of psychological warfare against the masses in order to quell their dark desires. They might rebel against our liberal elite democracy.
Unless you can keep them sedated.
Unless you can keep them sedated, yes. And this is the sort of, like I said, Freudian thinking is by nature very paranoid.
Mm-hmm. And again, this seems to come more and more into fruition now, especially with the fact that corporations like Disney have never been more powerful. In the sense that, people are just massive, rabid defenders of product. There's that wonderful quote from the YouTube channel Red Letter Media where they have their satirical podcast that's like making fun of like podcasts that are concerned with like products, when Jay Bauman says, don't ask questions, just consume product and then get excited for next product.
Well, it's that kind of attitude that really drives the consumer culture, and it's the result, and like I said, it's the result of advertisements, which are essentially a form of psychological warfare on the mind.
And what's interesting is that in a way it's ruined the idea of pleasure, because the point is not that the alternative is to become completely detached from enjoying anything in life. Because in Christianity, we're not Gnostics in the sense that there's nothing wrong with enjoying pleasures of life, like good food, entertainment, and, drink. But the point of people are turned into the consumer, they're only concerned with that. And they're not understanding of how you actually enjoy things, rather than they consume it rather than enjoy it. They're controlled by the product rather than controlling it.
In my personal life, if you've ever been on a wiki walk, do you know what a wiki walk is?
No, what is it?
It's where you basically are, you go onto a website like Wikipedia, and then you just sort of start clicking on anything that interests you, and you just keep clicking, and you keep reading, and then clicking, and it gets you into that. And if you're surfing on the internet long enough, it eventually gets you into a zone where you're just automatically clicking and clicking and clicking, and soon enough you have 5 hours of your day wasted. It's not only exhausting, and
it's pointless.
It's pointless. Yes, exactly. It's exhausting and pointless, and it kind of but it's sort of the a microcosm of what modernity has become, because human beings, we're not like animals in that once you turn off our rationality, because animals naturally do not have rationality, they can just function by pure instinct. But once you turn off human rationality, the instinct, the animal portion, just doesn't work properly, because we're not meant to just turn off our brains and be irrational. That it just makes us self-destructive, and
yes.
that's sort of what you fought. That's sort of the main problem with degeneracy. I mean, it's why we call it clown world.
This is what most religions actually try and do, regardless of. I mean, I'm a Catholic, so I believe Catholicism is true. But from Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, and whatnot, there's at least some concept of emphasizing restraint and a higher moral virtue than consume, right? Through fasting, prayer, meditation, whatever.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the best religions are like this, because there's a certain level. There's a certain level of discipline and self-control that is needed in order to have happiness.
People are, the thing is that the difficult thing is that understanding that there's a transcendent contentment that goes beyond just overloading your dopamine is something very hard to convince people of today in the modern world, even though everybody knows that they need something deeper. That's why things like yoga exist, and people like to say that they're spiritual but not religious, because we've been desensitized or trained to be anti-Christian. But a Buddha or a fake, white people Buddhism or whatever can say basically the exact same thing, and people will then believe it. I think the 21st century could be the century in which it's a century in which people are now intensely trying to desire meaning, even if they don't know it.
Oh yeah, I mean,
there's a study I found, or there was a statistic that kind of showed that yet people that are not religious tend to have a lot more loyalty towards certain brands. It's true.
I mean, that's not surprising. Because that's exactly what these corporations are going for whenever they do that. Like this is exactly what the leveling process, whereby we are constantly inundated with messages of egalitarianism and individualism. That's what they're trying to accomplish.
Which ironically is crushing the individual, because the individual needs virtue, not vice.
Well, not only that, but there's a great book by Robert Nisbet who talks about the origins of totalitarianism. It's called The Quest for Community. And he argues in the book that individualism the individualism of the 19th century was one of the main factors behind the rise of totalitarianism, because it was so destructive to traditional communities that people felt the need to embrace their desire for something greater than themselves. They put themselves at the mercy of
The state.
the state, which was the only thing that could unite them. Which is exactly,
again, it's interesting in that prior to, say, the Enlightenment, prior to people like Louis XIV, the state wasn't really a thing that the average person was concerned with. Well, not even that until much later, but just the identity of the state, the national government. People didn't really have that concept until much later.
Well, that's because liberalism and things like modern liberalism came out of absolutism. Why do you think that the most noxious and evil forms of like leftism came out of these kinds of absolute monarchies rather than the more aristocratic ones where the king wasn't trying to overthrow all of the nobles?
Mm-hmm.
It's because it was, the absolute monarch gave birth to the absolute liberal state is a degeneration of the absolute monarch.
Albeit there is the difference in that happened in absolutism in Prussia and Austria, in which liberalism never really, or at least Prussia west of the Elbe, liberalism never really took hold.
Well, that is true, and I would say
liberalism in Germany was centered around, Western Germany.
Well, I'm not saying that it's an inevitable process, because you could have an absolute monarch who's able to keep his hand on the power, on the ring of power. But what you find in monarchs like the last monarchs of Russia and France were complete weaklings, and because the previous monarchs, what the previous absolute monarchs did was that they got rid of any of the powerful noblemen who could challenge them and replaced them with bureaucrats. And then when the king was weak, the bureaucrats were like, well, why do we need this king guy? Let's just have our own democratic system. And then you get the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution.
Which it's interesting in that it's something Marx was right about, in the sense that you did essentially have a bourgeois revolution rather than a democratic one. It was more like people like Marat and Robespierre. They took over France, not the people.
I mean, well, let's be fair. Has there ever been like a revolution by the people, or no. was it a revolution that claimed to be of the people?
Yes,
because because that's sort of what we see with these kinds of movements. I mean, they're all about fulfilling the desires of the masses, sure, but it's always with them in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And furthermore, power can shape desire, and this is something that some postmodernists like Foucault talk about. Power can create things. Power can shape the desires of the masses through propaganda, through and things like that. And I think that's what I think that's sort of gets into what I'm trying to get at, which is that this kind of degeneracy that we're seeing is a result of very powerful people. They're just pushing this over and over.
And, for a long time, I had thought that they weren't doing it intentionally or in the sense of indirectly. Like, CEOs were like, well, we just want more money. Yeah. As of late, I think it's more clear that they are genuinely nefarious. Like, it's not really a stretch anymore to say that Hollywood is generally just run by a cult of pedophiles.
Well,
Hollywood is, ironically, what Hollywood depicts the Catholic Church as.
that is true, and I think that can be explained. I'm a fan of. I'm actually a fan of Platonic political philosophy now, because it's just so prophetic. You see, under classical liberalism, you had what Plato would have called an oligarchy, which is which is ruled by merchants, ruled by people who just want money. And while the baser appetites are like the driving force of society, there still are restraints on them, because in order to have money, you need to in order to earn a profit, you need certain virtues like thrift and hard work and obedience to the law, things like that, in order to all these bourgeois values. But at the beginning of the 20th century, we saw a transition from oligarchy to democracy. And Plato describes democracy as being all about the fulfillment of desire, the fulfillment of the desires of the masses. And they praise things like equality and individualism and tolerance. And he describes the democratic man as basically a relativist who gets angry because who is constantly angry because he doesn't want people to denigrate his particular way of life. But the entire purpose is, like I said, about fulfilling the desires of the masses rather than pursuing any kind of virtue. And then, and the final stage, after democracy gets so anarchistic, it gets to a certain point, you start seeing tyranny, which is basically democracy for the very top, where they get their desires, and the rest of the people have to submit to their desires.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, I like the language of saying that, well, the Enlightenment thinkers basically tried to argue that they were trying to set everybody free, but in reality, they just put everybody back in cages, in the sense that politicizing the average person, not only do I generally think they're not smart enough or educated enough to, understand and take part in greater politics. That's why even with the American Revolution, suffrage was, very limited, because there was still this idea that, well, the average, not everybody is capable of making this political decisions. Some people are, but now with democratization, everybody has to be concerned with this all the time. Like,
it gets worse with social media too. It's like global democracy now.
There's a quote from John Adams, I think, where he talks about, I have to study politics and war, so my sons will have the freedom to study like mathematics and philosophy. The irony of that is, of course, that's all backfired, in the sense that people are now have to be completely, everything is now politicized, and people can't escape it. Even say Scientific American, this very old like 175-year-old magazine about science, now says we have to back Joe Biden. We've never backed a candidate. There's no escaping politics now.
I know, and
people are not free of it. Politics has imprisoned people rather than set them free.
Well, what do you think is the connection between politicization and degeneracy? Because we mentioned before that political ideology seems to have replaced morality and virtue. But is there any other kind of connection you see between, degeneracy and consumerism and this mass politicization?
Well, they're kind of hand in hand, aren't they? It's mass consumerism and mass politicization. Brand is political now, and people don't have there again, things like the idea of people concerned with their own local stores, with their own local governments and towns, have given way to, what mega corporation do you have your loyalty to? What are you a fan of?
What are you a fan of? Yeah, I mean,
Instead of saying, like, Bishop Barron once said, like, one of the most important questions you can ask somebody to know about them is, what do you worship? And the thing is, you can substitute that for now as, what are you a fan of? Same thing.
Well, it is sort of like it does have this air. There is this air of veneration around certain fictional characters. I think I know people who take fictional characters and turn them into role models for themselves.
And there's nothing wrong with saying, oh, like, people have done this for, like, say, Hercules or Lysander or something.
Or the saints in Christianity.
Yes, and I think that's the ultimate kind of, because they're real.
Well, is Hercules actually real, or is he like a...
Well, no, I meant the saints are real, but I guess that's kind of the ultimate culmination of both having people that accomplished great things and you can learn from, and of course the fact that they can intercede for us, is also the fact that, well, they're a real person and that we can be like them.
Well, this is that's sort of getting into this idea of like PR now, because how much we don't really have people like her, like Joan of Arc anymore, because everything we see about like modern figures, including people we like Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump, it's very managed by like political public relations campaigns, and because people like Edward Bernays promoted this kind of idea of public relations campaigns.
The cult of personality.
I mean, cults of personality have always existed, but they were about like the person in general. But whereas when you have a public relations campaign, you can construct an ideal of the person,
or you can construct them as a brand.
Well, yeah, you're constructing them as a brand. This is actually something. There was a postmodernist named Jean Baudrillard, who talked about something called hyperreality. It's where you have a representation of something that isn't real, and the representation is the reality, but it's also fake. And the example he gives is like where an emperor hires a cartographer to make a map of his empire, but the empire fades away, and the map is treated as if it were still real, more so than the actual reality of the empire having shriveled up to a tiny bit of territory. The map itself doesn't represent anything in reality. The map is the reality. The fake is the real now. Hence hyper reality.
It's almost like you can compare it to how a lot of the conservative movement kind of treats America, in the sense of, we have to come together as one people. And I think that just does not exist anymore. It hasn't for some time. And it's only over the summer with the riots that you have people like Matt Walsh and other conservatives kind of finally realizing that the facade is cracked and that's not reality. And I guess the hope is that might help people understand that we have to look for a reality and future beyond America and classical liberalism, because it just doesn't work anymore, or if it ever did.
Well, I would say that having loyalty to your community is the first, and having an honest patriotism is a really good thing. But the like you said, this kind of conservative hyper reality does not get to like the actual reality of like America as a collection of. I'm sorry, but could you? There's a lot of noise on your end.
Oh, is there? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is this
You
better?
might want to. Yeah. It's much better. Thank you. Oh my.
So sometimes I fidget with stuff.
Oh, I'm exactly the same way. Uh, I tend to walk around to punch. Anyway, go on.
The point being that I've said this before, which is that they keep talking now about the silent majority again. The silent majority, the idea that, well, the majority, 60+% of the American population are just kind of moderate conservative white people or conservative, Hispanics or blacks that really just like America and just want a normalcy, and they don't like all of this. Well, because of mass immigration and endless bombardment of indoctrination by the media, the silent majority is a silenced plurality now.
That is true. What do you think of like Donald Trump? Donald Trump today announced that he's going to be creating something called the 1776 Commission, which is going to be he's going to be going it's a program that essentially what he's going to be doing is he's going to be going into public schools and forcing them to teach patriotic history to counteract critical race theory and stuff like that.
I mean, on the surface, that sounds based and great. The problem is that maybe it feels too little, too late. And again, I think the problem runs deeper than that. In the short term, trying to stop teaching this nut garbage to kids is good, but still, liberalism is how we got here in the first place.
Well, yeah, I mean, the other thing is it relates to your earlier idea that you're basically teaching people about an America that doesn't exist in part because of this critical race theory, and there needs to be a bit of acknowledgement of this.
There has to be an acknowledgement that we've lost something before people can try and get it back or restore something.
I'd say so. Yeah, I mean, if we're going to have like a renaissance, or a rebirth or a rebuilding, we need to understand that there was something that was taken away from us. So,
because there's that kind of the thing that kind of upsets me about conservatism is I kind of call it its impotent optimism. Like there's Twitter accounts like educating liberals and stuff like that, where still this idea that if you can just point out how wrong the left is on things enough times, something will change, and you can kind of go home. It's kind of the same thing with the left, where white girl will protest for water or something and think she's actually accomplished something. A conservative will say, "Hey, I just owned a liberal online and think he's accomplished something."
And aren't we? Are we really accomplishing something by having this conversation online?
No. I mean, I could say no, but at least we're talking about. At least we're trying to acknowledge reality.
I think there is something to what we're doing, and I think it's something that we'll have to understand if we're going to have an alternative to like mainstream consumerist products, and that's the importance of community.
Yes, people want belonging, and it's kind of made me think about it this way, because a lot of the idea of the on the right has always been nationalism, but I'm starting to rethink that, considering, for one thing, nationalism as we know it was born out of liberalism. Now, in part, it was different in different countries. Like English or British nationalism kind of started out as a healthy patriotism and evolved from there. But say like German nationalism was both kind of classical liberalism as well as kind of a disdain for the French. But it's still a modern invention. And I'm thinking people's loyalty to their local communities, or I would like to say tribe or clan, is, I think, a much better identity.
Well, nationalism,
and sorry, I have to point this out, is the fact that Canadian friends of mine say, like Argent or Settler's Lament, there's the point where there once was a, distinct Anglo-Canadian culture, which has been destroyed. And so it's kind of hard to be a nationalist or a patriot for something that just does not exist anymore.
Well,
but my community, like my neighbors and my town, that's something that's actually real.
Indeed. I mean, that's something I sometimes point out to my friends and neighbors in real life, that the people around, and that's actually something I pointed out in one of my libertarian response video. I said where this libertarian was trying to say that society wasn't real or something like that, and I said, well, I live in a community, and I live within a community, and people share values with me, share common everyday rituals with me. Mm-hmm. That's a real thing, and it's not some kind of abstraction like the free market.
Like for me, just the other week, me and my parents, we were all hanging out with our neighbors just for some drinks and just talking, and I felt, wow, I have an actual connection to these people that I've lived, near for my whole life. And I'm thinking, I actually have some concern for what happens to them, and they have concern for us. Whereas, why on earth do I care about what happens to somebody in California? Outside of basic human decency as a Christian, but as something that is real and interact with. And I think that's the same problem with democracy, right? Or with mass national democracy. Because
mass national democracy is like a pain. I mean,
it's the tyranny of everybody against everybody. Why on earth should I have any ability to influence the political, what happens to somebody on the other side of the country that I have no connection with? My own community, actually, I could theoretically go and talk to the mayor of my town or local representative. I can't talk to the president.
Of course not. But there's another thing about community that I wanted to touch on is, the reason why consumerism is so, these consumer products, people are so addicted to them. Huge part of it is because of the community that surrounds these products. Mm-hmm. And these communities are created by very powerful people, as I've described before. But these communities are what really make people attracted to them, because if you enjoy like, say, Song of Fire and Ice or Game of Thrones, there's an entire Game of Thrones fandom that you can participate in, and you can have people who all share this experience of watching Game of Thrones on television. And you can talk about it and connect with them on that level. And there was a progressive YouTuber that I watched some time ago, who talked about trying to resist corporate control of people. And he made a good point that if you want to appreciate, we should really have an appreciation of older media that corporations aren't pushing. We should have an appreciation of things that corporations aren't forcing down our throats, because that way we could we would be able to maybe resist this kind of thumb on the scales of
you can create a community around, even an online community around Shakespeare, because that's public domain, and that corporations can't come in. Because the thing is, it's kind of this, it's like, take Warhammer and Warhammer 40K, right? It starts out as this very, very small, very niche thing that was originally created by Games Workshop in the late 80s and had a very small following throughout the 90s. And then early 2000s, it starts kind of growing and growing, and the fandom grows. And then the corporations start stepping in and saying, we actually have to monitor this because we want to appeal appear as we want to have the right kind of consumers.
Well, yeah,
and that's the thing where you get like Comicsgate and stuff like that, wherein, well, now because geek culture is so mainstream and profitable now, they have, and I just like that idea of corporations want to have the right kind, they want the right type of customer now. It's not the idea the customer is always right, or the people that supported this product or this thing are what built it. No, now you get to impose on them what they're supposed to be.
Well, that's actually sort of the transition from democracy to tyranny, because because the older way, the democratic way, is the customer is always right. The institution should be purely a machine designed to fulfill the desires of whoever wants to purchase their product. But then you see with millennials the rise of ethical corporations. The idea that there needs to be they see right, and I think rightfully so. They see that this as we need to have some kind of values. We need to have some kind of more ethics placed on these corporations. They can't just be doing whatever. But because they're, well, like we've said before, they've replaced morality with political ideology. They're just going around politicizing everything. And what they'll say is that, well, everything is political because everything presupposes some kind of ideological worldview, which is correct, but there's two senses of the word politicize that they're kind of trading on. The first being, does this cultural product assume some kind of ideological worldview? And then the other is politicized as in getting it involved with democratic politics and things like that. Making it partisan.
Making it left wing.
Making it left wing, exactly. And that's the other sense of politicization.
And in a way, that's kind of why so much of right-wing attempted conservative and right-wing culture is so awful. That in Christian media is so terrible. It's because it already presupposes itself as being political, as being inherently, well, we are conservative. This is a conservative thing. And there's not actually an idea of, like, I'm not. You told me not to talk about anime, but this is technically not one. It's just a good example. I just finished rewatching Avatar: The Last Airbender, which has political stuff in it, but it still has inherently non-political point. It's just a basic hero's journey story, right? Their conservatives couldn't make that if they consider themselves trying to make conservative culture.
So yeah, I mean, this is sort of the thing that you see with these people. I've always considered conservative media in general to be lesser because they don't have the capital to access more talented people. Because because these things are all about power, right? You have, why is progressivism and consumerism and degeneracy, why are these things ascendant? Because powerful people want these things. And there's a variety of reasons that we've discussed before why powerful people want these things. And I think, but I think an important part is that, like you said before, they don't believe in Christianity anymore.
No, and more importantly, the people don't know Christianity anymore. They know brand. And the trick is people want meaning, but I think they need a way for it needs to be manifest in a way that's very clear to them, because modernity was a very easy sell to people because this makes you feel good, this tastes good, this sounds good, and people can immediately kind of attach themselves to it. And the ideology behind it is, you like doing this thing that makes you feel good, right? Yeah. Well, just keep voting for us and supporting us, and we'll make sure that the dopamine keeps flowing. Trying to convince somebody you have to stop this thing that makes you feel good in the short term and accumulate virtue. And then there's the point of like, it's kind of I'm just thinking about this now, is maybe in a way this is why conservatism also fails, is the fact that ultimately what we want is we're advertising that's something that is not political but moral and spiritual, and something outside of that. And politicians and politics can't make you a good person.
Well, this is a thing. Well, I would push back on this somewhat in that, I would agree with you that being left-wing or right-wing does not make you a good person. Adhering to some ideology, some political brand, it does not make you in and of yourself virtuous. However, I think that we can clearly see powerful people doing these types of things for political reasons. And I think, like I've mentioned before with Edward Bernays and people like that, they promote this consumerism and degeneracy because they have like an ideological agenda. Like they believe in democracy. They might honestly believe in democracy, or they might be trying to control the masses via Freudian psychoanalysis, things like that. And so it is political in that sense, but it's not political in the sense that it's about party politics.
Yeah, in a way, I'd say it's a political fight, but the fight is ultimately to depoliticize society.
That's actually a pretty good description. And
yeah, yes, the political fight for depoliticization, to make it so that the average person doesn't have to can understand that they don't have to identify with this thing to be a good person, and that they don't have to identify either with party or corporate brand to be happy, and the fact that, well, these things are actually more likely making them miserable.
So what would you say? I mean, you would say that you say that, but there's also these kinds of anti-SJWs who would also say that they want to depoliticize these corporate brands. What would you say is wrong with their views on things?
Because classical liberalism, which is kind of the ideology of these anti-SJWs, of people like Sargon and Louis Laval, whatever, is they're still under the, if say Total War or say Warhammer 40K or one of their favorite products suddenly started espousing Christianity, like hardline Christianity, they'd be furious, even though, like it says, well, it's not political.
Well, it's not political in the sense of, like, this is the what I would say to someone like Louis Laval and stuff is that they still accept the idea that they I think in spite of themselves, they believe in this idea that we can be, they go beyond being politicized in the first sense of being apart from party politics, and also they seem to think that we can be depoliticized in the first sense, which is not assuming any kind of ideological framework, including a Christian one. Mm-hmm. Because they see classical liberalism as this kind of non-ideological default.
Because their idea is that classical liberalism basically lets you that individual freedom is not ideological, even though it is like very clearly is. It had to be established by the Enlightenment.
It had to be established by powerful people pushing it. Like I've read, there's a great book I read, Bertrand de Juvenel, on power, and he talks about how the idea of the individual was created by by monarchs to undermine troublesome nobility. They would promote the serfs and they would call them freemen. And freemen were people who were loyal only to the king and God, and they were free from their feudal dues to aristocrats, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a product of political power, and that's the individual that celebrated by classical liberalism is a product of state power and political actors doing that for very specific cynical reasons. And so when they are talking about the individual as if it was some kind of natural thing, well, it's
It's
not
not.
really. It's not. Exactly.
I suppose in so many ways, the Enlightenment and liberalism and all of this are all Christian heresies in certain sense. There is the idea of the individual is, loved by God. The C.S. Lewis concept that, God loves you like Jesus would still die for you even if you were the only person on earth. But that's of course been, corrupted to basically mean the individual is a political entity now. By trying to free the individual as saying you're a free individual, you're an individual within the political machine, whereas before you weren't part of a political machine.
Well, it's worse than that, because the classical liberal understanding of freedom can only be achieved within that political machine.
Mm-hmm. You have to support us if you want to. You have to support your new masters in order to be free. Whereas before, you had probably much more freedom because you didn't have to worry about politics.
Well, it was a lot more relaxing. There's actually it was kind of funny because there was a great Vox article. Ironically enough, Vox made this article, and it's called "Life in Authoritarian States is Mostly Boring and Tolerable." And the author was arguing that the sort of the lack of democracy in the total Americans have this idea of authoritarian states as being brutal dictatorships and stuff, but the author went to one of the stereotypical authoritarian states, Malaysia, and he found that the people there live pretty much normal lives, and he described it as being pretty boring. And the only difference between life in America and life under authoritarian dictatorship like Malaysia is that the elections have basically no impact on anybody's lives, and people just don't care about elections because they know they're rigged, and so nobody gives a shit about them. They just go on with their lives like. And the author says this could easily happen in America. We could imagine America life carrying on as normal without Democrat versus Republican politics.
Which I think most of us would find being, to be quite nice.
It would be nice, except if Democrats get in charge, they're not going to run things like the dictatorship of Malaysia. They're going to be running things like Chairman Mao did.
Yes. Well, they currently are. They're just only somewhat slowed down. Well, essentially, the conservative movement it's basically if Mao tripped over his shoes every 10 minutes, but he's still doing everything else. That's all conservatives have done for 50 years.
I wouldn't denigrate conservatism that much, but that is essentially. What I would say is that in the Republican system, you have divided power like that, and so you're not able to have Chairman Mao exercising absolute control. You can't, for all the power Joe Biden would have if he became president, you don't see or rather, the people behind Joe Biden would have,
Mhm.
say, you wouldn't see him just acting like Chairman Mao. You don't see Chairman Joe Biden, ordering the execution of political dissidents and stuff. Because,
Kamala Harris might, but
well, there again, there's this idea of divided power within the liberal framework that progressives are working very hard to undermine as we speak.
I think I heard last night Argent and Serpkerp had a stream on, their thoughts on the election, and they made the point that in certain ways, America's kind of just a technocracy or oligarchy now. The real power is in the Supreme Court is in the Supreme and federal courts, I think, that can make decisions they should have had no business making. The fact that 9 unelected judges have now, it can basically rule on issues like abortion and other massively important issues is a gross misuse of power.
Mm.
And you also, of course, have the ascendancy of the imperial presidency, the fact the far more liberal use of the executive order.
Yeah, I would say that the monarch, what's happening is that it's becoming more or less it's becoming the sort of system that was put in place is sort of breaking down over time, and I think that's I'd say that is part of the degeneracy in general, because this is degeneracy. Like I said before, degeneracy is when you avoid doing what is good out of because you want to do what is pleasurable instead.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's happened on a political level is that we've sort of degenerated to the point where we're not even loyal to like the founding fathers' understanding of Republican freedom anymore. We've just basically like we're all extremely apathetic, and as long as we have porn and video games, we don't really need much else. Like I've talked to so many of these anti-SJWs who basically say that
they want to be able to masturbate and play video games and be left alone, and that's the end goal of their political views.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of that it. Yeah, and when you have people like that, it's no. And I've seen a few of them say that they join the left in a heartbeat if it means stopping the right from banning porn.
Mm-hmm.
So that isn't really that isn't it. It's no wonder if this is like our resistance. If this is la resistance to leftist takeover, it's no wonder things have gotten so bad.
Yes, because and it's even a degradation from, say, the founding fathers. Even though I ultimately disagree with classical liberalism, they saw some inherent transcendent good in their ideas, whereas this is now just, I want to satisfy the id, and my political ideology is what I'm going to stop anybody from telling me I can't enjoy the id. That's it.
So what would we I think we've identified a lot of really key issues here. Politicization, degeneracy, the decline of morality in general. And we've sort of linked them together as being the result of people just losing sight of something transcendent. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Well, I think Chesterton said, well, he said both, once you abolish the God, the government becomes God. And I think you can add the corporation and political party become God. he also said like somebody to the tune of great societies fall apart because they lose sight of obvious things.
Well, I think he also said that once you stop believing in God, you start believing in anything.
Yes.
And I think
that he showed, right? People that are less religious are more loyal to brands.
that's that is the irony that we see, and I think that
because you can see these people at like Star Wars, but there's like Star Wars celebration or something like that they have every few years, and just at these things or like E3 event for video games, people, it's like you're in a mega church, right? You're in this giant modernist building, and it's just how emotional can we make these people about, instead of say, we're playing this music because we have we're trying to spread evangelical Christianity. This is, we want to get these people to worship brand, like when they're like, this is a new Fallout game, and people just go completely insane.
Yeah, I mean that is the I guess that is the modern condition. I wanted to transition away from just talking about what's wrong, because I think we've identified that, to what is the alternative. And I've hinted at it, some ideas before, and I'd like to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, it's not going to sound very original, and I don't think you're going to disagree, but it's trying to get people to, number one, understand that the current system is not making them happy, and convince them that the emptiness and void and lack of contentment they're finding in their lives can't be fulfilled by corporations or by voting. That understanding there's a transcendent nature to humanity and that metaphysics are real, and eventually leading them to God, that's what actually will make them happy. And in a way, trying to get them to understand I guess that you can use the language of freedom too, right? That essentially we are trying to free people. We're trying to lead them out of Plato's cave and understanding there's so much more to life to be enjoyed than this. And I think just trying to support any movements that are, say, pro small businesses, decentralization of power, not nationalism. I would say even just trying to go to tribalism and supporting your local community, like being in with your own community, real community, not online over a brand, but your actual community in a place where you live. The problem with that is, of course, if you live in a big city and you're in a giant apartment block, everybody's kind of isolated from each other.
I would also add that these kinds of religious things, they don't work outside of community, and I think this is something that a lot of religious people have lost sight of.
Mm-hmm.
People like to think that people say that the sexual revolution came after the death of God, but there are some books like Mary Eberstadt, who she's a Catholic author, who points out that it was actually the sexual revolution that caused the decline of God, because once you destroy the family, you're starting to break down these kinds of communities, and once you do that, then you lose a lot of the impetus to go to church, really.
Yeah, and it's especially that isolation is one of the biggest reasons why people come out of colleges nowadays the way they do, almost as much, if not more so, than being indoctrinated by left-wing teachers. It's the fact that you're outside of the influence of your church and your parents, and essentially the entire culture there is to be as licentious and hedonistic as possible. And you can then, and it's perfect breeding grounds for people like Christopher Hitchens to come in and give them a good explanation as to another reason why they shouldn't go to church, because it's the reason why we're in a stupid war with Iraq, and why people are flying planes to buildings, and why people say that my gay friends can't get married, and if people can just get very angry about that.
It's like I mean, Christopher Hitch. I'm thinking of the meme where Christopher Hitchens, the kind of the guy with the gun, because Christopher Hitchens was a supporter of the war in Iraq.
Yes,
and so he's the guy with the gun, and he shoots Iraqi soldiers, American soldiers in Iraq, and then he says, Christianity did this.
Yes, I mean, and that's the funny thing, right? Is neoliberal foreign policy, to just go off topic for a second, goes hand in hand with all of this, because the political cause of anti-imperialism, that because then people can get behind movements just like brands as well. That's ergo the Black Lives Matter thing, is people want to feel like they're part of something important, but they don't actually want to put in any work. And it's ultimately why people are still fine with, Obama having drones, using drone strikes to kill thousands of children, is that's over there. And it also gives us a cause of no more imperialist wars.
So what would we say about so what are some like alternatives to just getting into these kinds of corporate fandoms?
Go to church.
Church?
Go to church, because I mean, people will of course cynically say, well, the Catholic Church is a corporation. No. It genuinely can actually offer real community and real answers to your questions in life. Because again, think about this, is Game of Thrones and Rick and Morty and Warhammer can't answer questions and give you fulfillment in life. They can't say, how do you be a good person? And the thing is, if the answer in the culture is, well, there's nothing you can do to be a good person because there's no such thing as a good person because of relativism, well, then obviously they're wrong, because people understand morality exists. And I think then it starts to break down that, well, these corporations, not only are they not capable of making you happy, they actively, are making you unhappy. Because even leftists, I've just noted, like they'll agree social media is unhealthy.
I would say there's also try to find things that aren't being this kind of heavily promoted thing by these giant corporations, and try to find people who would network with you over it and form a community that could support that hobby. Like, try to find maybe you have a cultural appreciation club. Like I'm studying the Czech language right now because that's my ethnic background, and I want to and I'm thinking about like networking with people who are also passionate about Czech culture, and trying to and because there's a large Czech community in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been wanting to getting COVID being what it is, it's getting in the way of this. But I've been wanting to get in contact with some of these people, and I think that there's also the whole COVID thing, which is part of what's made this so nefarious. That COVID is, people are trying, the political leaders are knowingly or not trying to destroy in life or real life communities.
Yes, because a caveat I would add though is, don't try and get into or create a community or get into a community just because it's a community that's trad. You should still like the thing. Like, let's say you don't like Shakespeare, you shouldn't then just join a Shakespeare community. Because I was also thinking something that's also important is skills. Like I'm trying to teach myself how to cook more, and like you're teaching yourself check.
That is correct.
And you can't, fast food is what it is, but in a way, actually learning how to cook, number one, it frees you from having dependence on brands. And it's a massively important, one of the most important skills you can learn.
Definitely.
And like corporations can't just own the concept of cooking.
I don't think you should allow corporations to monopolize the way you eat, because as they've been shown in recent months, they've been shown to be very much subverted. And I doubt there's a corporate CEO who actually likes. At this point, I don't see a lot of corporate CEOs standing up to like whatever is the de jure political cause of the day.
Mm-hmm. The other, and again, just if you can get yourself into things that, like, really being into Shakespeare is one thing, but again, as I said, cooking and gardening too, because not only are they not able to be controlled by the technocrats or the bourgeois, I just like to call them the bourgeois, the modern day bourgeois, but they're things that actively help you escape, because now if you can grow your own food and make your own food, you're less reliant on brand.
What are you doing that's helping with this?
Well, I'm teaching myself how to cook and learning from my dad. My dad has been a professional chef for most of his life, or was until a few decades ago. But so doing that, and when I eventually move and get a house, I would love to take up gardening. I'm also trying to teach myself languages because I recently got a job helping with a translation company, and I want to teach myself either German, French, or Chinese as an actual skill.
Mm. And
I hope you approve of me and are proud of me now, Geocon.
I'm not your dad, I'm not.
You're not my dad, God.
No. I'm not God either. I'm.
Though I will admit, I did buy some Warhammer figurines that I want to learn to paint. And I know that almost sounds like it goes against everything we've been talking about. There's nothing wrong with just enjoying something, but like, because then at least with that, I'm not just buying figures to look at. I'm looking forward to the joy of actually painting them.
I myself I don't really get into a lot of the fandoms, but I do like I do like certain fan fiction communities, because although yes, they're kind of paused, they're pretty degenerate sometimes. I think that there is some. I'd rather be around people who are more creative than not, because even if it's a kind of limited creativity that's based off of a derivative of a brand, uh, I would say that's better than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I also hang around like people who write like alternative history type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and I think that's also a very interesting. I wouldn't say there's a fandom, because it's not a fandom in the sense that it's around a corporate brand, because there isn't a alt history corporate brand.
Starting creative writing circles is a fantastic idea.
Oh, definitely.
There's a million trads that have creative ideas, and if they have, and the massive step in helping them along is having other people to critique and help them, and having people that you can share with, that you can trust aren't just going to laugh at you.
Maybe I could start start. I mean, there are people online that I've met that are very much into creativity and stuff. Like I actually did an interview a while ago about a few weeks back of this guy named Johnny who was talking about philosophy of art and creativity for the right wingers. I would I highly recommend you all anybody who hasn't seen it to check out that video because he's a very smart guy. I would say he's a very smart guy. Anyway, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this talk, a lot more than I thought we would.
Yeah, I'm glad we had it.
I mean, I would.
Go ahead.
Okay, go. I'd like to hear your final thoughts on it.
Because to bring it back to what I was kind of saying at the beginning of my projects in the future is because the book I have on solar punk, it's a collection of short stories and poems by these kind of young, pretentious creative writing students, presumably. And the thing is, what's stopping us from doing something similar?
Money.
Yeah. Well, you have that's yes, but the thing is, it's never been easier to get things published these days.
No, it isn't. But I mean, the only reason why these creative writing students are a dime a dozen is because there's people paying them to just publish things, even though there's nobody reading it.
I mean, I clearly I'm reading it, but
I guess so. But people like us are kind of weird. Like, do you think like the average like working class person is going to pick up a book on on solar punk?
Yeah, and again, no, I mean no, but and it kind of brings me to the last point is I know all the talk about the individual and the elite and all that is that there is, I think, a lot of truth to the point that the majority of people not only don't think about these things, but are practically incapable of thinking about these things. Not in the sense that they're mentally not, their IQ is not high enough to understand it, but just in the sense that their whole lives, like, it's that NPC meme, right? It's that so many people, if you actually try and explain this to them, they just kind of shut down and can't comprehend this. And I think that's something to kind of worry about, right? In trying to
what about us? I mean, we're not really that special. We're a couple of plebs. Like, how did we escape the programming of the NPCs?
That's true. Well, and I guess in a way, it kind of circles back to community in the sense that people can't understand the deeper idea that we want to escape brand worship and become trads, but they can understand, hey, learning how to cook or learning gardening is a good skill, and they can be part of a community.
I think that's sort of the purpose of things like this get together. It's not so much, it's for, in a lot of ways, it's not just for the good of whoever happens to be watching. It's also good for, the community, because as long as we're talking to each other, however limited it is through the internet, this is still a community, and we're still able to strengthen ourselves through this.
Amen.
Yeah. I would just, I think that was a very good. I think that's very good, and I want to get into the final section where we take a look at the limited number of comments. I see
there's 3 of them.
There's all three of them. Yes. Charlie Adams says, Fritz Imperial, great to see you again.
For me, it says message redacted.
Okay. Well, Charlie Adams is saying, Fritz Imperial, great to see you again.
Thank you. I'll hopefully get some content on my channel soon.
And we also have Colonel Autism. You're the comment of the video just for that name alone, by the way. Colonel Autism says the Hippocratic Oath is traditionalist. What would you say to that?
I don't know the Hippocratic Oath because, unlike most people, I'm not a nurse.
Like most people, you mean?
Yes. Well, no, in the sense of I know a million nurses.
Well, the Hippocratic Oath is essentially the oath to. It was originally. It was the idea that we would never do. It's a basic oath sworn by doctors to never do harm to their patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you look at it, it is pretty trad because the original Hippocratic Oath was all about you swore to a number of gods that you would never do injustice to your patients. So, in that sense, I think it's pretty trad. I think that yeah. I think with that we can wrap this live stream up. I'm
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Geocon, and it's been nice seeing you. Have a good night, everybody.